The snow came sideways that January morning in 1873, and M. Calloway stood in the doorway of his soddy on the Kansas plain, watching Helena Brock's barn, like a man watching a ship sail the wrong direction toward rocks. 14 months he'd been on this stretch of land northeast of Salina, long enough to know what a north wind out of the Dakota territories could do to green lumber and wet firewood. And yet there was Helena, the Bohemian widow from Teclaim's east, building herself a wall of straw bales around the outside of her barn like she was tucking a child into bed. Some people, he thought, brought their foolishness with them all the way from the old country. What happened over the next 11 weeks on that windswept stretch of central Kansas changed the way a dozen families thought about winter, about insulation, about the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books or from the land agent's office in town. Helena Brock had arrived in Selin County, Kansas in the spring of 1871, 2 years before the winter that made her famous in a 3-township radius. She came with her 14-year-old son, Thomas, a cast iron pot, a German Bohemian Bible with the spine cracked from too many crossings, and enough seed money from the sale of her husband's cobbler shop in Cincinnati to file on 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The neighbors who eventually moved in around her found a woman of medium height, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with the kind of hands that told you she'd been working since before she was old enough to know what work meant. She spoke English well enough, accented with the flat vowels of Moravia. She said what needed saying and left the rest unsaid, which in 1871 on the Kansas plain was considered a reasonable approach to life. Her husband Radovan had died of typhoid in Cincinnati in 1870, and Helena had spent the following year making up her mind about what to do next. A brother in Nebraska told her land was cheap, and the sky was bigger than anything she remembered from Berno. She had a memory of her father's farm outside the village of Tischendorf in Moravia, where the winters came hard off the Bohemian Moravian highlands, and you either understood heat retention or you understood death. Those two facts together were enough. She filed her claim in April of 1871, broke her first 40 acres with a rented team of oxen before the summer heat settled in, and by August had a soddy that would have impressed a seasoned plainsman. EMTT Calloway, who helped her set the roof beams, told his wife Dolores that the widow knew what she was doing, even if she didn't talk much while she did it. The barn came in the second summer, 1872. Thomas was 15 by then, big enough to be useful, with a post-hole digger, and together they raised a framed structure 28 feet long and 18 feet wide using lumber Helena had hauled 31 miles from the rail depot at Salina in 3 wagon loads. It wasn't beautiful rough-cut lumber, not entirely true. Stone foundation footings in 2 corners where the wood ran short, but it stood plumb, kept the rain off, and by September held her to mules, her milk cow, Clara, for pigs, and a winter's worth of firewood stacked in the north half. Then she started building the straw wall, and the laughing began. It was EMTT Calloway who noticed first, riding past on his way to the Pfeiffer place to borrow a 2-man saw. Young Thomas was stacking bales of last summer's wheat straw against the north exterior wall of the barn, 2 bales deep right up to the eave line. Just stacking them there like a second wall. Amt watched for a moment, then rode on without saying anything because he was a polite man. But he told Jacob Pfeiffer about it, and Jacob, who had been a Finnish carpenter in Ohio before the war and knew more about building than nearly anyone in the county, came by the following afternoon to have a look. "You're putting straw against your barn," Jacob said. It wasn't a question exactly. He stood with his thumbs in his belt, looking at the growing wall of bales. He was a solid man in his mid-40s, reddish going bald, with a carpenter's eye for structural things and a carpenter's instinct to distrust anything that wasn't nailed down. Helena was fitting a bale into place, working from a short wooden step stool to reach the upper course. She looked at Jacob the way a woman looks at a man who has stated the obvious. "I am putting straw against my barn," she agreed. "Your firewood is in that barn. Also, my mules, also, Clara." Jacob Pfeiffer stood quiet for a moment, Working through the logic, straw catches fire, he said, finally. You're building a haystack against a structure that contains an oil lantern and livestock that knocked things over. It was a legitimate concern. It was, in fact, the first concern any sensible person would raise, and Jacob was a sensible person. Straw fires on the plains were not uncommon and were not small. Helena nodded at his point the way she nodded at most points, acknowledging that she'd heard it without necessarily agreeing with it. I keep the lantern hung from the center beam, she said. The straw does not touch the inside, and I leave a gap at the south end where the door is. Jacob Pfeiffer went home and told his wife Marta and his boy Friedrich that the Brocker widow was going to burn her barn down. The story traveled by horseback and chance meeting at the creek, and the particular frontier telephone of women hanging laundry within shouting distance of each other. By the time it reached Reverend Aldous Crane at the small Methodist congregation that met at the Hadley place, it had the quality of settled fact. Helena Brock was doing something strange and probably dangerous with straw and her barn. Reverend Crane was not unkind. He was a man of genuine faith who had come west in 1868 following what he described as a calling. And what his congregation suspected was a disagreement with his bishop in Missouri. He was lean, sunburned with the deep-set eyes of a man who spent too much time looking at horizons. He stopped by Helena's claim on a Tuesday morning in late October, ostensibly to check on the widow's spiritual state as winter approached, really to see the straw wall for himself. By this time, it wrapped 3 sides of the barn, north, east, and west, standing about 6 feet high, and to bale lengths deep, 38 in a packed wheat straw between the barn siding in the open air. Mrs. Brock, he said after the pleasantries were finished and the coffee cup was in his hand on her front step. I understand you've built yourself quite a structure round the barn. Helena looked at him over her own cup. The prairie wind moved her hair. You've been talking to Empt, she said. And Jacob Pfeiffer and Agnes Tull, who had it from the Hadley women. He paused. Agnes Tull was the third name in the story. A widow like Helena, but of longer standing, 62 years old, sharp-minded, with the authority that comes from having outlasted 2 husbands, and a fever that took for neighbors in one August. If Agnes was talking about the straw wall, it had achieved official status in the community's attention. What does Agnes say? Helena asked. She says she doesn't understand it and that not understanding something is the first sign. You ought to pay attention to it. The Reverend smiled slightly. She also says that straw rots when it gets wet, and a rotting wall against your barn will draw mice and vermin and make the whole situation worse than having no wall at all. Elena set her cup down and looked at the barn for a moment. The straw bales were golden brown against the weathered lumber and in the thin October sunlight. They looked almost warm, which was in a way precisely the point. In Moravia, she said, my father's grandfather built his byre the same way. He called it a winter mantle, a winter coat. The straw does not rot if it is dry when you stack it, and if the roof overhang keeps the rain off. She paused. I left the gap on the south side because that is where the prevailing wind does not come from. Reverend Crane nodded slowly. He was, whatever his faults, a man who listened. But the Kansas Plain in 1872 was not Moravia. An ancient family practice did not always translate cleanly across an ocean in 40 years. He left without saying anything dismissive, which Helena appreciated, but also without being convinced, which she had expected. The fourth skeptic arrived uninvited on a Friday afternoon in early November. His name was Dalton Mercer, and he held a claim 9 miles south near the Smoky Hill River. He was a former corporal in the Union Army's 7th Kansas Cavalry, broad-shouldered, gay-bearded, with the direct manner of a man who had made fast decisions in bad conditions and considered this a permanent certificate of competence. He'd lost one of his own structures to a prairie fire in 1870, which gave him standing to speak on the subject of flammable materials. He pulled up at Helena's claim on his way back from the Hadley's and looked at the straw wall like a man eyeing a hazard that's going to catch. He said to Tomas, who was mending a fence rail near the barn, one spark off the Pfeiffer forge. this wind and you'll have a fire line right to your wall. Before you can blink, Tomas was 16, old enough to have heard this argument a few times. The Pfeiffer Forge is 1.25 miles east-southeast. The wind comes from the north and northwest. Mercer gave the boy a look that had probably made young cavalrymen uncomfortable during the war. "Wind changes," he said. Helena, overhearing from the doorway, came out and walked Mercer round the south side of the barn. She showed him the 18-in gap between the straw wall and the barn door, the wet burlap at each exposed straw face, the 2 water buckets at the northwest corner. "I have thought about fire," she said. "My husband thought about fire. His father thought about fire. If thinking about it made it certain, we would have burned down long ago." Mercer didn't laugh, but he rode away without endorsing the structure. And the words he used to describe it at the Hadley supper table that evening: peculiar, risky. Old country superstition followed Helena's straw wall through the winter social season. Here is what Helena Brock understood that her neighbors didn't, or at least understood in a more visceral way. Dry wheat straw properly stacked and compressed was one of the best insulators nature produced, without asking anything in return. She knew this the way a carpenter knows which way wood wants to split. Not from a textbook, but from watching and doing from winters in the Bohemian Moravian highlands, where the cold came hard off the mountains, and you either understood heat retention or you understood death. A wall of wheat straw bales 38 in deep could hold the temperature inside a structure at something close to stable. Across a 60 swing outside, the barn's animals and lumber generated the baseline warmth. The straw wall held it in, but what concerned Helena most was the firewood. Hauling splitwood from the creek bottoms was a full day's work for a full cord, and a full cord lasted a hard-pressed Kansas family perhaps 3 weeks in genuine winter. Wood was money, weight, time, and survival compressed into a pile. Wood that got wet burned at 1/3 of its dry efficiency, smoking, smoldering, consuming itself to drive off moisture before it could produce useful heat. Helena's first Kansas winter, 1871-72, had eaten her firewood 40% faster than she'd planned, because a wet October had soaked the bottom courses of her outdoor stack. She'd done that arithmetic standing in a half-cold soddy in February with Tomas sick. And for weeks of winter ahead, she didn't intend to do it again. Keep the wood inside the barn. Keep the barn stable and dry. Keep the straw wall around the barn. The logic was simple. The materials free. Every grain farm produced more straw than it needed. Helena had worked it out. The wall was the application. If you've been watching this channel and you haven't subscribed yet, I'd ask you to consider it now. What we're documenting here: the specific knowledge these settlers carried, the techniques they used, the reasoning behind decisions that looked strange from the outside. This is exactly the kind of frontier wisdom that disappears generation by generation unless someone makes a deliberate effort to hold on to it. Subscribe to help preserve this knowledge and keep these stories alive for everyone. Who comes after us? November passed cold, but not violently so. December came in with a week of freezes that hit 18 at night and barely climbed above 30 during the short days. The creek northeast of Helena's claim froze over in the second week, and the Calloway family's water barrel, left outside overnight, cracked from the expansion. EMTT told Helena about it when he stopped by to borrow her spare auger. She handed him the auger without mentioning that her own barrel, stored in the northeast corner of the barn, behind the straw wall, was still liquid. The real winter arrived. On the 14th of January, 1873, it came the way the bad ones always came on the Central Plains. Not gradually, but suddenly. A wall of Arctic air that dropped off the Dakota Plains in the night and hit central Kansas before dawn with a wind that knocked the mercury to 14 below Fahrenheit. By 7 in the morning and kept pushing, the sky went the color of old pewter. The wind came out of the northwest at something between 30 and 40 miles per hour, steady with gusts that rattled every window and door in every structure in a 3-count radius. It was the kind of storm that old-timers talked about in warning tones, and that newcomers experienced once and never forgot. EMTT Calloway was up at first light trying to reach his wood pile and found 3 feet of snow drifted hard against the north wall of his soddy, burying the lower half of his exterior wood pile in ice-crusted snow. The wood beneath it wasn't frozen through. Snow itself insulates, but it was wet and cold. What would burns like a man's ambitions, slowly and with more smoke. Then late, he burned a third more fuel, getting the soddy to 40 than he had any morning the previous week. Jacob Pfeiffer's situation was worse. He had built himself a proper frame house, not a soddy, because he was a carpenter and carpenters build frame houses on principle. His firewood was stacked under a lean-to on the south side of the house, and the drifting had come from the northwest at an angle that put 18 in of wet snow directly into the open face of the lean-to. The bottom 2 courses of his firewood stack were soaked through. Jacob spent the morning of January 14th burning green wood and cursing quietly in English and German in alternating sentences. Agnes Toll's cabin was for miles south of the Calloway claim. She kept it well supplied, but her woodshed had a problem. A small roof leak in the southeast corner that she'd meant to patch in November and hadn't. 3 weeks of freeze-thaw cycles had turned the southeast quarter of her wood pile into something that was technically wood, but burning with all the enthusiasm of wet clay. Dalton Mercer, 9 miles south near the river, lost his barn entirely on the morning of January 15th, not to fire, to wait, to 22 in of wet. Heavy snow had accumulated on a roof he'd built at too shallow a pitch, and the center ridge beam failed at 7 in the morning. With a sound his wife described as a cannon shot, Mercer had felt the structure groaning in the night and gotten his animals clear, which was the main thing. But 3 months of carefully split firewood stored in the North Bay went under the roof, and getting it back out in January, temperatures with a northwest wind at 30 miles per hour was not a morning's project. Helena Brock on the morning of January 14th milked, Clararer fed the mules, checked the straw wall for drift accumulation, and noted that the temperature inside the barn was holding at 29 F. Outside it was 14 below. The temperature differential across 38 in of wheat straw was 43. Her firewood stacked in the North Bay was dry. She burned 3/4 of her normal morning allotment to get the soddy to 55. In the normal time without excess smoke, Tomas came in from the barn at 8 o'clock in the morning and poured himself coffee. He was 16 now, quieter than he'd been as a small child, with his father's bohemian cheekbones and his mother's habit of observing before speaking. While is holding, he said. Helena nodded. I know Mr. Calloway's woodpile is going to be a problem. I know that too. Helena said they didn't go over to help Emt on the first day because the wind made travel dangerous, and because Emt was a man who needed to establish the extent of his own problem before accepting help. On the second day, when the temperature climbed to 3 below, Helena loaded the small sled with 8 arm loads of her dry firewood and sent Tomas to the Calloway claim. She sent a second load to Agnes Toll. She did this without comment that could be read as told you so, because she wasn't that kind of woman and because the frontier had enough ways to humble a person without neighbors piling on. EMTT Calloway helped Tomas unload the wood. He was a fair man, and fairness meant acknowledging what he was receiving. Your mother's wood is dry, he said, turning a split piece of cottonwood in his hands. It was the color of clean bone, not the grayish damp of his own stock. It's been inside the barn, Tomas said. I know where it's been, EMTT said. The straw wall. He looked out at the white plain. Tell your mother thank you and tell her I'd like to come by when the weather breaks and have a proper look at how she built that thing. The storm broke on January 17th. By the 20th, it was a stark clear wind, still 22. The kind of plains winter day that is almost beautiful if you're warm on that day. EMTT Calloway rode to Helena's barn. Jacob Pfeiffer walked over with his oldest boy, Friedrich, and Agnes Toll came in her wagon wrapped in 3 blankets. They all stood outside the straw wall, the way people stand before a thing they've been disagreeing with. When events have settled the argument, Helena walked them around it. She showed them the south end gap, the wet burlap at the straw bases, the water buckets at the northwest corner, every fire precaution Jacob had worried about. She showed them the 14-in roof overhang on 3 sides built from her leftover lumber that kept rain and snow off the top course. She explained that the bales went cut face in, not stem out because the cut face shed moisture better. She explained the winter mantle. She spoke plainly because the thing had worked, and plain speech was all it needed. Jacob Pfeiffer asked about compression, whether the straw settled over time and left cold gaps. Helena had checked the bale faces every 2 weeks through November and December. 2 in of compression across the full wall height. She'd shimmed the gaps with loose straw. Not a permanent solution, she said, but a winter solution, and a winter was what she needed. How warm inside? Agnes asked. 29 that first morning. Outside was 14 below. Agnes did that arithmetic quickly. 43 of difference. She looked at the wall with the expression of a woman who had outlasted a lot of winters and was recalculating something. I lost a third of my wood stack, she said. What was? Dry I burned at twice the normal rate. Helena said she would share what she had. Agnes accepted this with a Kentucky woman's dignity, taking it fully without making a ceremony of it. EMTT Calloway measured the wall with the cloth tape from his saddlebag, because that was how he processed things. 38.5 in, he announced. He ran his thumb along a bale face and stood quiet. I've been thinking about insulation wrong. He said finally. It was an admission that cost him something. I've been thinking it's something you put inside a wall between the boards, not something you put outside. My father put it outside, Helena said. He said, you want the cold to meet the insulation before it meets the wall, not after, and nodded. He spent the following 3 days building his own version around his woodshed, and he told his neighbors about it honestly, including where the idea had come from. If this story is the kind of history you care about, the practical knowledge, the real techniques, the human decisions that made life possible out here, we'd be grateful for your subscription. There are hundreds of these stories, and most of them are in danger of being lost entirely. Hit subscribe and help us keep documenting them. The question of why straw worked so well was something these settlers understood imperfectly, but well enough to use, which was the important thing. The principle was the same as a goose-down quilt, dead air trapped and still resisting the movement of heat. Dry wheat straw at 38 in depth was by that measure a better insulator than anything the settlers could have bought at any price, and the supply was inexhaustible on any grain farm. It was not new knowledge. Chinese farmers in the northern provinces had stacked sorghum stalks against their urn walls for centuries. The Norse had packed turf round their long houses against Scandinavian winters. Helena's Moravian family had carried the practice across 3 generations. In the Bohemian Highlands, drywood at 15% moisture content produced roughly 1/3 more heat per pound than wood at 35%. Helena had calculated that difference the hard way in 1871 to 772. The straw wall was her answer to not doing it again. She checked her wood pile every few days through February and found it consistent. Cool to the touch, no frost on the split faces, burning with a clean snap when lit. Reverend Crane came by in the first week of February, ostensibly to check on the family after the worst of the January storm, actually, because he was an honest man and honest men acknowledge when they've been wrong. He stood at the south end of the barn and looked at the straw wall for a long moment, without saying anything. Helena poured him coffee on the front step of the soddy the way she always did, and they talked about the storm and the road conditions and the Hadley family's new baby, born on January 16th at the height of the blizzard with no help beyond what Agnes Tull and Dolores Calloway could provide by lantern light in a saddy that had dropped to 40 before they'd got the fire fully going. The baby is well, Helena asked. Healthy as a colt, Crane said. Agnes says she's never delivered a sturdier one. He paused. Agnes also says that if she'd had a straw wall around her woodshed, she'd have had better wood to burn that night. He held the coffee cup in both hands the way cold people hold cups. She says, you were right. That's not a thing Agnes says often or lightly. Helena accepted this without comment. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Brock, Crane said, not for doubting. Doubt is reasonable in novel circumstances, but for speaking my doubt publicly before I'd thought about it properly. He looked out at the plain. The snow was still deep and blue-white in the morning light, and the sky above it was the particular, clear cobalt of a plains winter day after a storm, in my experience. People carry useful knowledge from wherever they came from. I should remember to ask about it before I judge it. Elena looked at him steadily. You were not unkind, she said. EMTT Calloway measured the wall. Jacob Pfeiffer built his own version. You made an apology. This is how it is supposed to work. The Reverend smiled slowly, and for a moment he looked younger than he usually did. What do you call the technique? You mentioned something to me last fall. Winter mantle. Helena said in German. My father's family used the Czech to zimny. Plashed, a winter coat. It is the same word in both languages almost. Crane turned the phrase over. A winter coat, he said. Yes, that's exactly what it is. And that is what it was called informally in that 3-township area of Salem County. For as long as anyone who'd been there that winter was still alive to name it, the winter mantle. A winter coat for a structure that needed to stay warm. Not complex, not expensive, not even original. It was ancient, the way the best survival technologies tend to be, but on a Kansas plain in the 1870s, far from any agricultural journal that might have published it. It was the property of a quiet bohemian widow who'd carried it across an ocean in her memory and applied it to a new problem in a new land. Dalton Mercer rode up from his place in the second week of February to buy lumber for his collapsed barn and stopped at Helena's claim because the road ran past it. He stood at the straw wall for a longer time than the others had because he had more to reckon with. He'd lost the barn. He'd gotten his animals clear. That was the main thing. And he knew it. But 3 months of his own carefully split firewood was buried under the collapsed roof. In January temperatures, and getting it out was not a project he'd enjoyed. How much straw for the wall? He asked. 47 bales. Helena said. 2 bales deep. 1 bale wide per course. 7 courses high. Mercer did the arithmetic. I've got enough from the threshing. Maybe 40 bales left in the field stack. He was quiet for a moment. My roof pitch was too shallow. He added it was not precisely an apology and not precisely an admission. It was a man accounting to himself in front of a witness, which on the frontier was sometimes the best you could do. Yes, Helena agreed, because there was no useful purpose in pretending otherwise. I'll build the new roof steeper, Mercer said, and I'll put a straw wall around 3 sides. Not the south side, Helena said. Leave the south for the door and the air. The straw needs to be dry when you stack it, and the roof overhang needs to cover the top course by at least a foot. Mercer looked at her for a moment with an expression that was something between assessment and respect. The particular expression of a man who has spent his life evaluating competence in other people and has just recalibrated his estimate. Where do you learn this? He asked. My father's grandfather. Built that way, Helena said. He learned it from his father. How far back does it go? Helena thought about it. Far enough, she said. Far enough that nobody remembers when it started, only that it worked. The winter of 1873 broke in early March. Helena spent those last weeks taking stock. Her firewood entering March was 11 cords down from 14. 3 of her own and a half cord she'd given away. That was roughly 8% below her original calculation. The difference between wetwood and dry showing up in every morning fire. Her mules were healthy. Clara was in good condition, producing 3 1/2 quarts of milk daily. The pigs had come through without losses. The straw wall, when she dismantled it in the last week of March, was intact, 3 in of compression across the full height, every gap she'd shimmed with loose straw still holding. She and Tomas spread the bales as mulch on the kitchen garden. Not a straw was wasted. This was in its way the final argument for the technique. It used a farm surplus, the straw that would otherwise have been burned or left to rot. And when winter was done, it went back to the land. The winter mantle spread through Saline County in the way useful frontier knowledge always spread, not through newspapers or meetings, but through the particular persuasion of visible results. The Callies built their own version that October. Jacob Pfeiffer added a proper shed roof over his. Agnes Toll wrapped 3 sides of her entire cabin and reported a quarter reduction in fuel consumption. Dalton Mercer put a straw wall around his rebuilt barn and lost nothing to the winter of 187,374. Reverend Crane mentioned the technique in a letter to the Salina Daily Union that November, attributing it to Moravian agricultural tradition, as demonstrated by a widow of that origin resident in this county. Helena didn't read the newspaper regularly and found out from Agnes Toll, who read it aloud over tea. Helena's reaction was a short silence and a slight nod, which was about as much as she gave to most events. That involved other people acknowledging she'd been right. What no letter could convey was what it meant to stand in that barn on January 14th with 14 below outside and 29 inside with dry wood and healthy animals and the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had thought things through, that her family was going to be all right. The firewood she'd hauled 31 miles from Salina was going to do its job, because she'd kept it dry, and she'd kept it dry because she thought about the problem correctly. The right way was the old way. Old knowledge is not inferior knowledge. It is tested knowledge tried against the hardest possible examiner, the actual world in actual conditions, and preserved precisely because it worked. Helena Brock carried that knowledge across an ocean and 700 meters of American continent, and every cord of drywood she burned that winter was a small proof of something people forget and relearn in every generation, that those who figured things out before us were not less capable than us, and that techniques developed under genuine necessity are worth more than the dismissal we sometimes give them. There's something worth sitting with in that image. The women stacking bales in the October afternoon, neighbors riding past and shaking their heads, the wall going up course by course in thin prairie sunlight, plain and unglamorous. Not magic. Just old knowledge applied to a new situation by someone who'd had the sense to carry it and the steadiness to use it without caring too much what the neighbors thought. The January wind would make the point she hadn't bothered to argue, and Calloway said it best in the way that plain-spoken people sometimes stumble into the exact right words. He said it standing in Helena's barn in the last week of March, watching her and Tomas take down the straw wall bale by bale in the early spring sunshine, the bales golden and intact, the barn lumber behind them still weathered and gray and perfectly sound. You didn't build anything new, he said, you just remembered something that was already true. Helena looked at the bale in her hands for a moment, then handed it to Tomas and looked at EMTT. That is most of what good building is. She said she wasn't wrong. She almost never was about the things that mattered. If these stories speak to you, the plain-spoken knowledge, the hard-won techniques, the people who survived because they understood what they were dealing with, we'd be honored to have you along for the next one. Hit the like button if you found this worth your time, and subscribe to keep the record of frontier wisdom alive. These stories are worth preserving, and every subscriber helps ensure they don't disappear. We'll see you in the next one.